My guest at this time is Marc Levin. He is the Vice President of Criminal Justice Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He joins me now to discuss the First Step Act, which is a bipartisan effort to reform the criminal justice system. However, there are still some very fierce and vocal critics. And Marc, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Speaker Paul Ryan is making this a major priority here in the final days of his speakership in the lame duck session of Congress. President Trump is also pushing this. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has worked on this quite a bit. Your organization is also quite positive. Explain why.
Sure. Well, it really builds on the success in many states, especially conservative states like Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, where we've basically shown it's possible to both reduce the prison population and increase public safety. And so the problem now is, in many cases, we're just warehousing people, including in the federal prison system. And so they actually leave often worse than when they came in. They're not going through programs that address the very reasons why they committed crime, bad thinking patterns, impulsive thinking, addiction, mental illness. And then, of course, giving folks a skill so they can read, so they can perform some sort of job and earn a legal living and be productive citizens when they get out of prison. So the First Step Act was put together to address all of these issues, and it passed the House, actually, with only 2 Republicans in the U.S. House voting against it. And now we're on the verge of hopefully having it go through the Senate in the next week or two. But it's all up to Leader McConnell on whether to bring this up.
Do you think he will?
Well, we're optimistic. There's a lot of discussions going on. It's virtually every day we're seeing more Republican senators sign on to the First Step Act, and we're very active. We have, for Right on Crime, which is our national initiative that I founded, we have a group of people like Newt Gingrich, who actually wrote an op-ed that just went up on Fox News about an hour ago, but he was one of the first national conservative leaders to sign our statement of principles, which goes back to 2010. But it basically says, here's how conservatives should approach criminal justice. And of course, we want to hold people accountable. We also have to hold the government accountable for, just like we would in healthcare or welfare or other policies for getting results. And but we, certainly don't want to be too tough on taxpayers. And finally, we kind of have to recognize people can change, that redemption is part of the human condition, and that there's, of course, some people who need to stay in prison for the rest of their life. And in Texas, we execute some people. But for the most part, we're talking about, and what this bill focuses on, the First Step Act, is nonviolent offenders. For example, one of the provisions that was added deals with drug sentencing. There are people now, for a drug offense, they end up with life in federal prison, and this reduces that mandatory minimum to 25 years. So I'd say that's still pretty tough. But it is moving in the direction of saying we have to lock up people we're afraid of, not those we're mad at.
Now, most media coverage of criminal justice reform talks about sentencing reforms, which is a big part of this, and shortening the sentences of nonviolent offenders, especially those convicted on drug violations. And without much media attention being paid to anti-recidivism programs, which are also part of this, a lot of people are getting the impression that the bill essentially amounts to going lighter on crime in terms of the punishment. So what's your response to that?
Well, that's an excellent point. And so really the core of the First Step Act is expanding rehabilitation programs in federal prisons, and it does provide an incentive. Now, there's a lot of inmates who aren't eligible for it. Actually, from page 7 to page 12 of the bill highlights every violent and sex crime, terrorism, you name it. But for nonviolent inmates, and also, people like Bernie Madoff are excluded, some really, serious nonviolent offenses like that. But for those that are eligible, there's actually a General Accounting Office report that found that currently a lot of federal inmates just decline these programs because there's no incentive to do so. And of course, I would say, they really should do it. But from our standpoint, we want to provide an incentive, and it's a relatively modest incentive, of course, that basically they would be able to earn time towards being in a halfway house, a reintegration program. So it actually does not reduce their sentence. They simply earn time towards being transitioned into the community, which actually benefits us. It's having someone go straight from a high security prison to just being on the street is not the kind of transition that the research says will reduce recidivism. And we really, our ultimate goal is so when these people are back living next to you and me, they're less of a threat to society, and they're actually holding a job and paying taxes, being productive.
What are the anti-recidivism measures? Get a little more specific on those if you can. You talked about how transitioning to a halfway house, for example, before full release is a way to help bring people back into society and help them to be functioning members of society, not just thrown back in there. What else is part of this mix, and how are you confident that these measures will be successful?
First of all, there's an assessment of each prisoner, because not every prisoner has the same needs, and so that it's customized to. It's kind of like education; you have to customize it to the student. And then the interventions basically include things like cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, where you actually challenge someone's assumptions and their thinking patterns. A lot of people that commit crime, they have antisocial, anti-authority attitudes. And those have to be confronted. And then, of course, addiction and mental health treatment, educational and vocational programs to get people, for example, a skill, something where they could be a welder, for example, jobs that are in high demand, so that when they leave prison, they're prepared to earn an honest living. So those are the kinds of programs that will be expanded. The bill does provide some additional funding to implement these programs in the coming years in the federal prison system. So I'm confident that it will be implemented successfully, because actually it's happened in so many states. And, the states that have taken these approaches have, in fact, seen crime go down more than those that haven't over the last 10 years.
And I know often Texas, where you are, and Georgia are cited as examples of these programs working in the past. What is your reaction, I guess specifically, but maybe even generally as well, to the likes of Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas? I know we talked about some of the issues related to sentencing a moment ago, but he does not see it the same way in terms of credits towards transitioning to a halfway house and so forth. He thinks it's just making life easier for these inmates and effectively getting them out sooner into that environment. And he says it would even be applicable to folks who are fentanyl dealers, for example. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, unfortunately, he's put out a lot of information that's not accurate. And in fact, anybody who's a supervisor, manager, anybody who's, a significant drug dealer, they're excluded from this legislation. So it's just false. We're talking about is people that have possessed drugs for an addiction, or perhaps they're using drugs with, a friend, a brother or sister. But any major drug dealer is totally excluded from this. So, but what Senator Cotton doesn't recognize is 99% of people that go to prison are being released now. And so the question is, are we going to release them and as less of a threat to society and than more of a threat? So it is disappointing that I think he's put out a number of things that just aren't true about the bill. It excludes sex offenders, rapists. So unfortunately, this is kind of what you encounter. And I think, frankly, we have to remember if the Senate doesn't act on this, Nancy Pelosi, unfortunately, is going to become Speaker in January. And she is, I don't believe, going to work well with President Trump, who, of course, strongly supports this bill, not to mention the Fraternal Order of Police. But she's not going to work well with Leader McConnell either, I don't think. And so what I'm worried about is if the Senate doesn't act on this in the next couple of weeks, this is just going to be used as a political issue going into 2020 to blame Republicans for not doing criminal justice reform. I think, unfortunately, Cotton is just trying to run out the clock on this, and it's going to put conservatives in a very difficult position in next year.
Last question. In the Senate, one person can actually stop things from happening much more effectively than in the House of Representatives. What's your read on this situation? I asked you earlier if you thought Mitch McConnell would bring it forward. In the end, do you expect by the time we get to the turn of the year and the new Congress that this will be done or not?
Well, I'm feeling more optimistic about it, but it is hard to predict. But I know the Senate is hoping to leave by December 14th, so we're really just talking about a couple of weeks. But more and more senators, Rob Portman just came on board, for example. Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, Senator Lamar Alexander, just in the last few days, all these people are joining as co-sponsors of the First Step Act. So I think we're already probably at about half the Republican caucus in the Senate, plus all the Democrats. So obviously that's 75 or so senators. But I think we're going to get to, well over 80, 85, maybe even 90. And so as we kind of creep up in the next several days to get to that perhaps 2/3 of the Republican caucus being supportive of this, I think that will tip things over as far as Leader McConnell being willing to move forward. There's the continuing resolution on the budget, the farm bill. He does have a lot to manage, and I totally respect that. But I think Leader McConnell believes this is good policy, and he's just trying to make it work with the timetable and the other priorities.
Well, we'll be watching. Marc, thanks very much for your time and helping us understand the debate much better.
Thank you.
Marc Levin is Vice President of Criminal Justice Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He also founded Right on Crime. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.